This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com. And today we have a legendary announcer from AWA, WWE, and other places that we'll get into. One of my favorite wrestling announcers, Ken Resnick. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm good, Hannibal. Thank you for the very kind words. And I'm glad we were finally able to do this. It should be fun.
Yeah, we've been working on this one for a while, and I'm glad it's able to happen.
Thank
So,
you for having me.
oh, it's a pleasure. Are you still living in Minnesota? I assume so.
Yes. Yep. I was born here and still live here.
Oh,
Although December, January, February, and March, I question my sanity about why I'm still living here.
yeah, that's probably similar to me up in Canada, but at least in the US, you have the option of moving down to Florida for those months, I guess, if you want.
Well, I'll tell you what, going all the way back to my AWA days, we used to go to Winnipeg once a month to tape up there. And Winnipeg, other than the winter months, it was one of my favorite cities. So I've got wonderful memories of Winnipeg. And when I was with WWF, I used to go to Maple Leaf Gardens and I would do color with Gorilla Monsoon there for matches on primetime. So Canada always has a very great place in my heart because I've loved my times there.
I read online that you actually started off doing media relations and marketing for the Calgary Cowboys. Is that right?
Well, I was with the Minnesota Fighting Saints. And then when the Saints folded, I got a call from Calgary and went up and spent about 7, 8 months living in Calgary with the old WHA Calgary Cowboys. So you're exactly right.
Were you a wrestling fan growing up?
I to a degree, living in Minnesota, the AWA was so big. So I had gone to a few live shows, and like so many other people in the Twin Cities, used to watch it on Sunday mornings.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about how big wrestling was in Minnesota? Because it's hard for some people to understand the territories that are younger.
Uh, it was huge. Uh, I used to kid people that I never thought I would be host of a show on Sunday mornings that had higher ratings than the Reverend Robert Schuler. But in the time slot on Sunday mornings, All Star Wrestling from the AWA was the highest rated program in the Twin Cities. It was huge. We used to wrestle at the St. Paul Civic Center on Sunday nights, and it was nothing to get 15 to 20,000 people. In the territories, we went up to Winnipeg once a month because back in those days, you had to have Canadian content on any programs, and we aired on CKND in Winnipeg. So we would go up once a month, do the house show at the old Winnipeg Arena, and then we would tape Canadian TV, tape the matches at a high school in Winnipeg.
Very interesting. So they kept you busy. How did you first become involved in the AWA?
Uh, it was the infamous right place at the right time. I was working at my first job in television. I was a sports director at the NBC affiliate in Rochester, Minnesota, which so many people know because it's the home of the Mayo Clinic. And there was a big celebrity golf and tennis tournament at that time up here in the Twin Cities. It was known as Duff Celebrity Golf and Tennis Tournament. And Hannibal, when I say it was big, like they would have the cast of MASH one year, they had the cast of Hill Street Blues one year, Lonnie Anderson was there, Gerald Ford, former president, was there. They would get 20 to 25,000 fans there just on the days of the golf tournament. And kind of making a long story short, they had an area that they called Celebrity Corner, where they would interview all the celebrities, over a loudspeaker. so it would give the fans a chance to kind of get to know them. And they asked me if I would host that. And amongst the people that, came along that I was going to interview in front of the crowd was Vern Gagne. And again, being from here and having, grown up watching, the AWA, I was able to, ask him intelligent wrestling related questions. I had a good time. Everything was fine. And that was it. And then the party that night, he came up to me and asked, where I was from and what I was doing and what my background was, and I told him everything. We had a nice visit and that was it. And then about 2 weeks later, I get a call at the television station in Rochester. And the switchboard operator says, "You're never going to believe this. Vern Gagne is on the phone and wants to talk to you." And it was Vern. He wanted to know, am I ever up on weekends? And I said, I'm back in the Twin Cities, almost every weekend because, we did the news Monday through Friday and then there was weekend people. And he said, well, how about, are you free for lunch on Saturday? And, I said, sure. But, and we set a time and a place and I kind of hung up thinking, why in the world is Vern Gagne calling me to have lunch? What's wrong with this photo? And he was just taken to me. We had a nice lunch. And then he said, how would you like to come back to the Twin Cities and work for me and start, work in the office? He was taken with the fact, as you referenced, that I had done public relations and marketing for 2 professional hockey teams. He said, you can help us in the office. He said, we've got Gene Okerlund, but I want to integrate you to start doing interviews as well. So that's how I ended up moving back and starting with the AWA.
Now, Vern was already always known as being kind of a kayfabe type of guy. Did he keep kayfabe to you for a while, or did he smarten you up right away?
No, he kept kayfabe, and I had a college degree. I'd been around the block. And it was kind of bordering on the ridiculous. At interview day, he was trying to kayfabe, heels on one side, babyface on the other. We'd get ready to do an interview, whether I was doing it or early on, Gene was still there doing it. And if Vern didn't like something, he would, cut. And then like the babyface would go, behind the backdrop on one side, and the heel would go on the other side, and Vern would go back. And, you could hear them talking, and then all of a sudden they'd each walk out the same side. It was like nothing had ever happened, and they were going to do the interview over because they hated each other. So he kept it. I've told this story. One day at TV, Vern, during a break, said, hey, we were getting ready to go to, as it happens, Winnipeg. And he said, when we get back that Monday, I want to have you out to the camp. I was just thinking that, I want to start having you do some more play-by-play, and just showing you a bunch of the holds will probably, help you doing play-by-play. And I was like, okay, fine. And that was it. And then that night, I got a phone call from Hulk, of all people, who was still the AWA. And he said, they want to know where I live. And he said, I'm going to pick you up tomorrow morning when we go to the airport. He said, oh, I need to talk to you. And I'm like, okay, why is the top guy in the territory coming to pick me up? And he did. And I got in the car, and Hulk said, listen, he said, all this is predetermined and the work. He said, whatever you do, don't you dare go to that camp, because all he wants to do is stretch you, hurt you, and make you believe this is real. And then Hulk was one that proceeded to smarten me up, because I guess he decided I was an okay guy. And he said, you know what? I don't want to see him get hurt because Vern's trying to kayfabe him.
What were your thoughts on the whole situation with Hulk, as he describes in his book and many interviews, that Vern just wasn't treating him right, and that's what led to him jumping to WWE, which ultimately was a huge blow to Vern?
Hulk was right. The reality is, and one of the reasons I left, uh, they just, you know, didn't treat people all that well. And I remember I had a bit of a conversation with Hulk. One of the things he was upset about was, you know, they were selling the T-shirt with his likeness as they were some of the other top stars, but they weren't giving them, you know, any residuals. The attitude was, "Hey, without us, you're nothing, so you're not entitled to anything." Um, and I know that bothered him a great deal. And I remember, you know, we talked. You know, everybody knew he was thinking about it, and you know, by then, you know, being a wrestling fan, even I was watching, you know, WWF at the time. You know, their production, their matches, everything. And I remember saying, you know, what's holding up the decision? You know, what are you even thinking about? And it was interesting and very true. He said that Vern had the one thing that Vince could not offer him, and that was time off. Because, you know, the AWA, again, as you talked about, we had the territories, the big markets, Chicago, Milwaukee, Winnipeg, Denver, Salt Lake. But oftentimes the guys would take off. They do Thursday, Friday, Saturday, a show Sunday, and they'd be home Monday. We do interviews on Tuesday. They'd be off Wednesday and leave again Thursday. And, you know, when anybody went with Vince, I mean, you were on the road 20, 25 days a month easily. And that was his big hesitancy. But, you know, in the end, he let him know he had a commitment. He was in Japan that he was not going to be coming back to the AWA. And one of the things that, you know, I just didn't think was right. They, knowing he wasn't going to be there, they kept, you know, advertising him on the upcoming house shows. But he could have been treated with a lot more respect, as could a lot of, you know, other guys. So money was certainly a huge, huge part of it. But I think the respect factor and how you were treated probably played into his and other people's decisions.
As far as Nick Bockwinkel, what were your experiences like with him, and what kind of a guy was he outside the ring?
Uh, Nick was one of the all-time great heels. Uh, Outside the ring, he was one of the nicest, sweetest people you could ever meet. And I've always said, um, how lucky was I to, you know, be able to learn the business and, you know, get help and understand the philosophies from people like, you know, Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan and the Crusher and Mad Dog, you know, Blackjack Lanza. I mean, back in the kayfabe era, kind of everybody had each other's backs. And, you know, I was new and really didn't, you know, just beginning to grasp and understand the business. Uh, and, you know, I would do an interview and sometimes we'd have a break and, or like Nick and Bobby, or Crusher or Mad Dog would say, you know, you did this, but think about if instead of asking that, if you would have asked it this way. So, you know, they realized that the better I did, the better I could make them look, the better the interviews would go. So they were all just incredibly helpful to me and it just wonderful. And the same, Bobby Heenan was one of the greatest, you know, nicest, but funniest human beings around. And I think you probably know this, Hannibal, that in reality, the the majority of the time, the best heels away from the business are just the nicest people.
Yeah, and sometimes the faces are the ones with the biggest egos.
Yeah, you know, that's true. But at the same time, uh, you know, back in the AWA, I mean, what a wonderful, wonderful guy the Crusher was. You know, I got to know him, and you know, if we have time, I've got a couple great stories about Crusher. But just learning the business from all those guys was just, amazing. And, I think back on having the opportunity to get to know all of them away from the business. They were just, great. Even as great a heel or baby face, but as much insanity as he played, what a great guy Mad Dog Vachon was. And just, having the chance to get to know them, and I reflect back now that so many of the huge stars that I had the privilege of working with in AWA and WWF, are gone now. Kind of a testament to all that travel and the beating everybody took. I mean, it wasn't an easy life.
What did you think about Mad Dog Vachon's reputation of being one of the toughest wrestlers of all time?
It was well earned. Back in those days, it was the pay-per-view was just coming into being. And, the way they made money was, by the amount of tickets sold at house shows. So not purposely, working stiff, but they took what they did, really serious. And, Mad Dog was one of those guys that I think if he was working with someone that he didn't feel was putting the effort into it or selling when he was supposed to be selling, like working with the Road Warriors, it could become a very painful experience.
That's right. You would have been around right at the inception of the Road Warriors. Any stories about those two?
Uh, and I have told this. Um, the first time they came back into the AWA, I think they had just returned from Japan. But I had seen some of their matches. They got to TV late, uh, and I think this was after Gene had already left for WWF. So I was doing all the interviews, and they got there, and as soon as they got there, it was like they were going to do the next interview, and just the way they did interviews, I have said that was the only interview I can remember doing where I was apprehensive and intimidated about working with those guys. But once I got to know, Paul and Joel and Mike, they were tremendous. But they were intimidating, and the stories always used to be, whether it was at TV or a house show, whoever was going to be working with them, you kind of felt a little sorry for, because you knew it was not going to be a pleasurable experience.
Now, you mentioned you had a couple Crusher stories. Do you mind sharing one of them?
Oh, sure. Uh, I mean, he was fabulous to interview, because you just never knew what he was going to come up with. But I had gone with Crusher early in the morning. I'd picked him up. He was in town. We were going to do the #1 morning radio talk show. It was on KS95, an FM station, Nappin' Donuts. So we went and did, the show, and it was great. And, we're, driving back, and it was really the first extended one-on-one time I had with the Crusher. And he was asking where I was from, a little bit about, my family. And I happened to tell him, my mother, who was a registered nurse, was now a nursing home administrator. And I said, believe me, Crusher, I can tell you, my mom is not a huge wrestling fan. She watches because I'm on, but a lot of the residents know who her son is, and you are literally like a god in that nursing home to all those residents. And he said, really? And I said, absolutely. More than anything, my mom says people ask her, what she can tell them about you through me. And he says, well, where's the nursing home? And we were going down the freeway. And I said, it's about 10, 12 minutes, off. And he said, well, come on, let's go. I'll go visit with the people. And I kind of looked at him and he said, no, really, go ahead. I've got a couple hours. And just out of the clear blue, when he heard that, and because, I guess, my mom worked there, that we got there right before lunch. And, I walked into my mom's office and Crusher comes right behind me and she looks up and her jaw almost drops. So the residents were gathering, in the lunchroom, and she comes in, says, there's someone here that would like to meet you all. And in walks the Crusher. And he spent about an hour and a half with those people, visiting with everyone. Just, I mean, the nicest guy.
There's a fan on here named Steven that wants to know if the entry of the Road Warriors into the AWA changed the direction of the company at all, in your opinion.
When I don't know if it changed the direction, because it was just the beginning of the kind of WWF national takeover. But remember, the AWA had Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan and the Crusher and Mad Dog and Larry and Kurt Hennig and the Blackjacks. It certainly enhanced the houses, because they were there, and it made it, they were must see TV. And what I've said is, I'm pretty sure Vern and Greg and Wally Carbo brought them in to be major heels. But the way they worked, the way they did the interviews, the crowd absolutely loved them. And it didn't matter who they were working with. When that Iron Maiden played and the fans knew the Road Warriors were coming out, the place went crazy. That no matter what they tried to do to make them heels, they were over with the fans, where they almost, in spite of it, demanded and said, they are our favorites. So they ended up, working as baby faces, because the crowd just wouldn't accept them as heels. They were that over.
A fan on here is bringing up, he remembers a promo of Hawk putting a turkey leg in your mouth.
Yeah, I know exactly what he means. And the backstory on that was, Wally Carbo, Nick Bockwinkel, and Jack Lanza had bought Winnipeg from Vern, and they were now running Winnipeg. And the Road Warriors, and they were going to work with Chris Markov and Boris Zukov, a Russian tag team, as they were, really building the houses. And Vern didn't want them to do interviews. I think he secretly hoped that Winnipeg was not going to do that well, because he no longer owned it. So they, Jack and Wally wanted an interview with the Road Warriors. So we actually kind of did that, kayfabe, if you will, at the party room in the apartment complex I lived in. And that was the only interview we were doing for Winnipeg. So they're getting set up, and as your fan remembers, and many people have seen, I started the interview, seriously, and Animal comes in and Hawk comes in, and Animal's talking, and all of a sudden Hawk says, wait a minute. And he just walks off, and he goes to the refrigerator in this party room and finds this big turkey drumstick that could have been laying in that refrigerator for 6 months. So he comes back, walks out, back in the interview, takes his, I'll tell you what Russians taste like, takes what we're going to do, takes this big bite of the turkey leg, and the turkey leg was like rotten, and he starts like spitting it out. And Animal is cracking up, and you can see me, I'm just biting my lip. Hawk walks back out, and he's trying to spit this stuff out. And Animal's watching, and then he walks away and just leaves me there. And I'm trying to save the interview. Hawk comes back in, tries to stuff some turkey down, in my mouth, but we somehow got through it. But you can see, I mean, me literally biting my lip because I'm thinking this is like gold. I don't think they'll ever air it, but sometime this is going to be one of the all-time greats. And we got through it, and the only place it ever aired was on CKND TV in Winnipeg. But somehow, like so much today, how that it got out on YouTube, I have no idea. But yeah, it's one of the all-time classics.
That goes to show you that with these writers writing the promos, you just can't beat the spur of the moment stuff.
Well, you're exactly right, and today's product is so different. But one of the things, there just doesn't seem to be the same kind of passion and spontaneity. And one of the questions I get asked so often, how much of it was rehearsed? And the answer is almost none of it. I would know, what the match is, what town, the name of the building, when it is. And a lot of times, especially with the bigger names, whether it's the Road Warriors, Hulk, Macho Man, anybody, I'd sometimes say, you got anything special you want to do? And most times, no, you just start and I'll follow. And we just winged it. I mean, we would just do it, and what happened. And maybe we had to redo like maybe 2% of them. And in those days, as everything was market specific. There was no national cable deals. So sometimes on an interview day, especially with when I was with WWF, sometimes we'd have to do 75 to 100 interviews throughout the day, but we rarely had to do one over. And it was just whatever came out. It was generally pretty good.
Dan Masters, who's the ring announcer for PCW Ultra in LA, says he worked with you on Ring Warriors. Yep. And he enjoyed it, and he wishes you safe travels.
Oh, thank you, Dan, and the very same to you. I loved working with Dan, and he's just a terrific guy. And Dan, I certainly hope something comes along where our paths cross again. Wish you absolutely all the best. Dan is just a great guy and a great ring announcer.
Yeah, he's one of the best ring announcers out there today, in my opinion. There's a few fans that are asking about the Wrestle Rock Rumble that you had a couple lines in.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah, I call it the gift that just will not die. It was, I don't know who talked Vern and Greg, into that, but it was obviously a takeoff on the Bears kind of Super Bowl shuffle. I was great. I got to go out to Vegas and film my parts, but I think back, as infamous as that is, I'm the only one that had 2 segments. I started it and I finished it. Everybody else only had to have one. And having done editing and production, it didn't make sense. And some of us, they took us out and we filmed segments out in Las Vegas. And then they've got others, like Greg, who does his just in somebody's basement in front of a microphone. But it was the one thing I can say and readily admit, the Wrestle Rock Rumble goes to show that I don't have enough rhythm to rap, but as others have said, compared to others, I wasn't all that bad.
Yeah, compared to Vern, I think you were, I don't know, one of the top rappers. You were Eminem, maybe, compared to Vern.
I'll take that as a very low-level compliment.
I think it was Marty Jannetty that said when they first wanted to call themselves the Rockers, Vern thought that they were referring to rocking chairs.
I would believe that. One of the things I'll add that someone pointed out a while back, and I went and looked at it, over half the people in the Wrestle Rock Rumble are gone, which is sad.
Out of all the deaths with the wrestlers, is there anyone in particular that hit you the hardest?
Kurt Hennig. I Kurt was kind of just starting out about the time I got to the AWA. So in some ways, we kind of grew up together. But he was one of the nicest guys that would, all do anything he could for you. And had such a wonderful family. Of course, Larry the Axe was his best friend. I knew Larry and his wife, Kurt's wife. So of all of them, that was the one that just you know hurt the worst. Certainly, you know, Roddy Piper. I knew it was coming. George the Animal Steel. All these guys, and certainly the Macho Man, who had squared away and was doing so very well. In fact, I'll give you a great Macho Man story, kind of again shedding light on what they were like uh, away from the ring. A number of years ago, I had undergone a corneal transplant, serious eye surgery, um, and was recovering. And a good friend of mine lived in Tampa, Florida. In fact, worked for the Home Shopping Network and happened to go into a Boston market and was waiting in line. And who comes in to get food but the Macho Man? So she goes up and introduces herself, and as did a lot of people, but said, a really, really good friend of mine. And Macho probably was a little disbelieved. He said, "Oh yeah, who would that be?" And she said, "Ken Resnick." And he goes, "Oh my God, how's he doing?" And she mentioned to him that I had just undergone, this surgery, and still possibility of rejection. And he said, "If you got his number, call him." And she calls me up and she said, "Hey," we talked. She said, "Listen, I've got somebody here that wants to talk to you." And he gets on the phone. He goes, "Ken, it's Macho Man. What am with your eye, brother? Talk to me. How you doing?" And he said, well, when he found out, he said, "Well, God, call him. I want to talk to him." So again, kind of like you mentioned earlier, what was Nick Bockwinkel like, as Randy got his, life squared away and was with his childhood sweetheart, it just become this great guy. So, hearing that one, also hurt. Scott Ledoux, who was a big part of the Wrestle Rock Rumble. And I actually served with Scott on the Minnesota Amateur Sports Commission, and then diagnosed with ALS, and, kind of watch him deteriorate. It's hard. From my standpoint, it's not the death of somebody famous, but somebody and liked and worked with. So some of them were tough, but Kurt's certainly the toughest.
Did Kurt ever play a rib on you at all?
Everybody asks that, and he was notorious. And a lot of people said, "How come you didn't have more ribs played on you?" And I think the guys, back then were smart enough to know that, I'm going to be doing their interviews, so I could try and make them look as good as possible, or I could maybe try and make them look not so good. So I think, I kind of had a pass from a lot of them. It was like, "Hey, wait, Ken, yeah, Ken, if you wanted to, can make me look bad." So I think I'm going to stay away from him.
That is a good point. You don't want to anger the people whose job it is to make you look good.
I'll tell you who did pull one of the all-time great ribs on me was Bobby Heenan. He was another one that was notorious. And what happened, this was when I was in WWF, as I mentioned, sometimes we would have to do like 75 interviews. And they would almost always have somebody from the office there. Many times it was Howard Finkel, that would have the rundown and, the bullet points, but they would always send them to me too. We'd gotten into Pittsburgh. I think my flight was late, so I checked into the hotel and headed right to the arena. And when I got there, I found out whoever was coming in from the office, their plane was delayed too. They weren't there, and I had forgotten my rundown sheet in my room. So I was trying to think who might still be at the hotel. And I knew Bobby was waiting for someone that would be coming down later. So I called the hotel, got a hold of Bobby, and told him what happened and asked if he would get the rundown list and bring it down. He said he would. So I had to call the desk, tell them who I was, identify myself, and ask them to give Bobby a key to my room so he could get in to get the list. And I did all that, and we're waiting. And now it's dawning on me that I just gave Bobby Heenan unsupervised access to my room. And he comes down, gives me the list, and I said, "What'd you do to my room?" He said, "Nothing." He said, "Come on." He said, "A rib's a rib, but not like this. Yeah, you have to work on it. It would be too easy." And, I was a little suspect, but okay. So at the end of the house show, we get back to the room late. We're going to go down to the bar and have a drink. And I go to my room and I put the key in. And Hannibal, I'm like opening my door inch by inch. I get the door open, don't see anything. Check the bathroom, check under the bed, I'm pulling the drawers out because I'm thinking maybe turn them upside down. Checking my luggage, checking everywhere. I don't find anything. So I'm guessing, okay, he was true. He was honest. He didn't do anything. So I go to the bar and I go up. I said, "Bobby, let me buy you a drink." He kind of looks at me. I said, "You were right. You didn't do anything in my room and I appreciate it." He said, "I told you I didn't. Geez, what kind of guy you think I am?" So I have a couple of drinks and, now I go back to my room, take my contacts out, get ready and, pull back the bedspread and climb, into bed. And I scream at the top of my lungs, "Heenan!" And I hear him laughing outside my door. What he had done, he must have gone to the restaurant and gotten like 2 or 3 salt shakers, pulled back the bed in the white sheets, just poured all this salt on the sheets, and then remade the bed.
Great ideas. I would never think of anything
Yeah,
like
I
that.
mean, but that's the genius of Bobby Heenan, and with his salt, everywhere, in the sheets, on the blanket. It was like I had to just, throw the bedspread back on top, which is the dirtiest part of the whole thing, and just lay on top of that and sleep on that. So that was a genius, like you said. I would have never thought of that in a million years, but Bobby picked it out right away.
How are your experiences with Jesse Ventura over the years?
I mean, fine. Um, I worked with Jesse at AWA and then, got a chance to work. I didn't interact with him much in WWF because, he was doing the commentary. And even if we were at the same house show, he'd be out doing commentary and I'd be back, still doing interviews. But interesting story, when Jesse was elected governor, I had been appointed by the previous governor to serve on the Minnesota Amateur Sports Commission, representing the congressional district I was in. And before Jesse got in the race, he was a friend, and I was campaigning did some events for Norm Coleman, who was a Republican candidate running against Skip Humphrey, the son of Hubert Humphrey, as a Democrat, and Jesse was the independent. And I had run into Jesse at a charity event. And he came up to me kind of good naturedly in typical Jesse fashion and said, "I just want to know one thing. When I'm elected governor, you're going to MC and do events for me?" And I said, thinking he's got no chance, like most people. I said, "Jesse, if you're governor, you want me to MC something, I'm there." Well, he got elected governor. And to his credit, he actually called me and had me MC one of his inaugural events. And then when I came up for reappointment to the sports commission, I got a call from someone in the governor's office asking me if I would consider serving another term. And I said, "Look, I appreciate it. I understand completely. I know I campaigned for his opponent. We go way back, but those are what happens. Elections have consequences, and you get to appoint your supporters or your friends to these, gubernatorial appointments." And the guy said, "No, you don't understand. Jesse wants to know if you're would serve another term, you're reappointed. So, he reappointed me. And then one other quick Jesse story you'll like. I got a call about a year or so into his gubernatorial term from the E television network that did the true life Hollywood story of Jesse Ventura. And they called and wanted to know if they wanted to come out and film me. They said, we've been researching. You worked with him in wrestling. You know his family. He reappointed you to the sports commission. We'd just like to come out and interview you. And I said, well, I have no problem. But look, I just want to check with Jesse to make sure he's okay with it. That, as I would have done to anyone. So I called his office, got hold of his chief of staff, explained everything to him. And he said, I will check with the governor and call you back. And he called back about an hour and a half later and said, I talked to the governor. He really appreciates the fact you took the time to call. He's fine with it. They're going to interview him. He's fine with you being on the show, but he really appreciates it. So, I called E back and we set up a date. And then about an hour later, my phone rings and it's Jesse. And he goes, just remember one thing. You say anything bad about me, I still know where you live.
That's hilarious. There's a bunch of fans on here asking about Ken Patera. He's been a guest of mine about 2 or 3 times now and quite a colorful character. Any experiences with him?
When I got into wrestling, I got along great with Ken. He had no problem. One of the reasons, well before I ever, thought about getting into wrestling, Ken was married to a gal, and her son played on a little league team that a friend of mine was manager for, coach of. So I had got to know Ken a little bit at those little league games when he would come. So when I ended up coming, into the AWA at the first TV, when he came in, he knew me and we had a little bit of rapport. So I always got along great with Ken. Had no problem with him at all.
What was the reason that you jumped from AWA to WWE?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, and I want to clear one thing up. Everybody thinks that Vince, stole me away, and that was not the case. As we talked about earlier with Hulk, kind of the way they treated a lot of people, that I was just done. And my last night was the night of Wrestle Rock. And I told our executive producer, then Mike Shields, that's it. I was done. Before I got into television, I had been a district sales manager for Chrysler Corporation, and I had already talked to them about coming back. So I was done. I was going to take a couple weeks, and then I was going to hopefully start work for Chrysler Corporation again. That was it. I was done. And about 2 nights later, Jack Lanza, who had left and was now an agent for the WWF, called, just said, hey, want to know, what the finishes were. Nothing, that, he should know or would be a secret. But, he was on the road. Want to know what happened, what the crowd was, what the matches were like. We talked and, and then he said, anything else happened? And I said, well, I quit. And he started laughing, didn't believe me. I said, no, Jack, that was it. I didn't go in, Monday, Tuesday, I'm done. And he asked me what I was going to do. And I, told him probably going to go back to work for Chrysler. And he said, well, he said, I'm coming to town tomorrow night. And I said, no, I'm taking another week off. There's nothing final, but that's what I plan. And they've been very receptive to it. He called me back the next night. And he said, we're going to have breakfast tomorrow. And I said, okay, great. He said, I'll pick you up at 6:00 and wear a coat and tie. And I'm like, Jack, I'm not getting up at 6:00 in the morning to have breakfast with anybody. And I sure as heck, I'm not wearing a coat and tie to go out for breakfast. He said, I'm picking you up at 6 a.m., wear a coat and tie. We're going to New York. Vince wants to see you. And I started laughing. And I said, Jack, you don't think I know a rib when I hear one? He said, call Northwest Airlines, ask if there's not a prepaid ticket in your name and my name for the 7:40 flight tomorrow to LaGuardia. And sure enough, there was. And I flew out and passed through, interviewed with Pat Patterson and Arnie Skolin and George Scott and Terry Garvin, and finally got in to see Vince, and he hired me right in his office. But I didn't jump. I had no intention, had no thoughts of going to WWF. Had never had any conversations with anyone, and it just kind of came out of the clear blue.
Were your jobs with AWA and WWE independent contractor, or were they putting announcers under salary like WCW used to do?
I was salaried at both of them, and would get the kind of difference. Even though I was salaried, uh, when I would sometimes at a house show, end up being like the celebrity ring announcer for the main event if I happened to be there because we've been doing interviews. They always gave me extra. While I was there, they treated me great.
There's been a few fans that have wanted me to ask you any memories of Andre the Giant.
I actually spent a day with Andre and Vince at his ranch. Um, when they came back from Japan and he was going to do the machine gimmick, they wanted to do some interviews. So I got a call the day before, and George Scott saying I have to meet them in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we're going out to the ranch to do interviews with Andre. So I got a chance to spend a day with him. We didn't like hang around away from the business like he did with Tim, but he knew me because he had come into the AWA to do once around the territory battle royals. So he had recognition, and we had met. Got to spend the day at the ranch with he and Frenchie and Jackie. And my favorite memory was afterwards, we're sitting in his living room, and all the furniture was custom made. So I'm sitting in this chair that was made for Andre, and my feet are literally dangling in the air. The chair was so high, I couldn't touch the floor.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Roddy Piper's death was one of the ones that hit you. What was your relationship like with him over the years?
It was great. I have said that one of the things that Roddy had the ability to do during interviews, he would always be well aware. Was this 3 weeks before, 2 weeks before, week of, and his intensity would build and build and build. In fact, one of the questions I would get asked most often by fans is Roddy as psychotic as he comes off on some of his interviews? But he was great. None of them were rehearsed. And, I told the story that when we were doing TV, about an hour before, I get called in and say, you're going to be Roddy's guest tonight on Piper's Pit. And I'm like, huh? What? It was a huge segment. And, it turned out I was going to come out, start the show. And then, Adrian was going to come out and attack him. And so it was all laid out. But again, even then, we didn't rehearse anything. So they call me, and I'm standing at the curtain, and I'm standing there next to Roddy, and suddenly we hadn't talked about anything. The music starts to play, and I'm thinking, is he just going to rip me apart? I mean, not physically, but Roddy had that ability. And I had no idea what to expect. And just as he walked out, Roddy turned to me and winked. And, he walked out and introduced me as one of the great announcers of all time. Just, couldn't have been, any nicer. Another funny story. I was in line, had just flown in to pick up a rent-a-car, to go to the hotel and go to the arena. And all of a sudden I get a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and here's some guy in a ball cap and a warm-up suit and sunglasses. And the guy goes, You go to the arena? I said, well, yeah, but I'm going to my hotel first. And he goes, well, where are you staying? And it was like, if I said, do I know you? And he lifts up his glasses and the cap and he says, it's me, Piper. He was just kind of traveling incognito where nobody would recognize him. And he said, good, I've stayed there too. So he rode with me. We went to the hotel and down to the arena. But Roddy was great. And, it was one of those that, one of the, mega, mega superstars that I had worked with and got to know and appreciated so much. And, just, like so many gone way too young. But, as I mentioned, it's different when you're a fan of someone that dies way too young, as opposed to being someone that and worked with and genuinely liked. So that was another one that was just hard.
Yeah, that was really unfortunate. His daughter's in the wrestling business a little bit now. The Ultimate Warrior would have been starting in WWE right around the time that you were finishing up. Did you ever have any interaction with him?
Very, limited. Just, met him. Hi. In fact, because Gene had started to come back then. So honestly, Hannibal, I don't know if that I ever actually did an on-air interview with Ultimate.
What was the highlight of your WWE announcing career for you?
Well, I mean, a lot of it was, suddenly I'm doing interviews again with Hulk, but with the Macho Man, with Rowdy Piper. But the two of the highlights for me, one of the first interviews I did with Hulk, and he had used a little bit in AWA, but wasn't that big a deal. We're starting to do an interview, and he just kind of, again, completely unrehearsed, to me, said, wait a minute, before we talk about that, there's something you and I got to get straight. And I'm thinking to myself, what's he going to do now? And he said, from here on in, there is no more Ken Resnick. And I'm going like, I mean, the first thing that came to mind, Hannibal, was like, well, wait a minute, is he firing me on the air? What's going on? And then he goes, ahead and puts me over and gives me the Killer Ken nickname. And it's funny, but that's how fans sometimes greet me 30 some years later. Just that he thought enough of me to really want to put me over early on. I would say that one. And the first time they called and wanted me to do color working with Gorilla Monsoon. And Gorilla was so wonderful and couldn't have been nicer and did everything he could to not only put me over, but make sure, he worked me into the broadcast, gave me plenty of time to comment. So that, and of course, being able to say that I was a guest on Piper's Pit are probably the top three that come to mind. And spending the day with Andre at the ranch was pretty cool too.
Adrian Adonis was in both WWE and AWA. Any memories of him?
Again, I got along with him, uh, but again, because I as the interviewer, I had a little power. Adrian could be a little difficult, and it was funny. On the Piper's Pit that he came out and interrupted. He actually came out a little early, and after it was all over, he came up to me and he said, "Hey, I kind of owe you. I think I came out a little too soon and cut you off." So and again, that was another one to drown in an accident. You just, um, you just shake your head and you kind of go, why?
I read that you were also the announcer for the American Gladiators live tour.
Yep.
How did that whole situation happen?
Uh, it was funny. Um, Somebody, I'm trying to think. uh, recommended me, and they called me to come out to New York and kind of hired me right in the office. It was David Fishoff Productions. Um, I'm thinking I had done a lot of things for Franklin Sports and got to know Larry Franklin, who was the president, and Joel Carlick, who was kind of the vice president of marketing. And I think they were using some Franklin equipment and looking for a host, and Franklin recommended me. But that one kind of came out of the clear blue.
And that would have been right at the peak of American Gladiators in the early 90s. How was that different than wrestling, being on the road with that bunch?
Well, we lived on tour buses. We went out and rehearsed and put the show together for about 5 days in Portland, Maine. Wrestling, you'd go back to the hotel, you'd get on a plane, fly to the next city. Here, we did 9 straight days, and then the 10th day we would have off in whatever town we happened to live in. So that was grueling. I mean, just physically demanding, trying to sleep on tour buses, getting into some towns sometimes 5 o'clock in the morning, not knowing what city you were in. And you'll probably get a kick out of this as a host of the show. I'd always come out and start the show and try and get the crowd warmed up a little bit. And come out, and I'm just standing there, and I'm going, oh yeah, we're in Indiana. That's right. So I go out, come running out, and I go, Indianapolis, we are so glad to be here. The sound guy is yelling in my ear, Fort Wayne, we're in Fort Wayne. So I got recovered, and I said, hey, I'm just kidding. That's what everybody thinks the only big city is. We're so glad to be here in Fort Wayne. Then they kind of, roared. But it was, when you get in, and it was a little like wrestling, but more grueling on the tour bus. I can remember many days I'd wake up in a hotel room, and, back in those days before smartphones, there was a phone book in every, nightstand. So there were many days I'd kind of wake up in the morning and lean over and open the nightstand and look at the phone book to remember what city I was in.
Yeah, I can imagine in those days. It was better that way in some ways. The last guy I'll ask you about today, I think one day we'll have to do a part 2 now that you figured out StreamYard, because the fans are.
We have to give credit where it's due. Your wife figured out how to get me to do StreamYard.
Yeah, exactly. So God bless her for hooking us up. I was a little worried there.
Me too.
So Dennis would like to know if you have any stories about the original superstar Billy Graham.
I really don't. He was kind of he was on his way out. I met him, and he's in some pictures, but he was doing battle royals. One of the all-time great interviews, and certainly perfected that gimmick. So I didn't get a chance to spend a lot of time with him in the AWA. And then, in the WWF, I couldn't believe where he had hip replacement surgery and still came back. But I mean, he was the prototype bodybuilder.
Now, I know you have Facebook. How can fans reach out to you or follow you? If you want them to follow you, where can they look you up?
I have my Facebook page. People say, how come you're not on Twitter? And I think I'm not all that interesting. I'd be boring. But they can follow me on Facebook, although I'm worried because I'm getting real close to that 5,000 maximum. I know a lot of wrestling fans are friends with Martin T. Mart D'Amato on Facebook, who does all these live Facebook events and Facebook signings. I'm going to be doing one with him